Merci à vous. Permettez-moi de présenter mes délibérations en anglais. J'espère que ça sera accepté par vous. Ladies and gentlemen, it is widely known that Catholic doctrine counts 3 sacraments that are linked with the notion of character indelibilis. The sacraments are baptism, confirmation, and ordination. Referring to these 3 sacraments, character means an incorruptible and unrepeatable spiritual sign. It should be noted that according to Christian teaching, the term character points to the fact that God will never revoke his benevolent care and salvific grace from the individual who receives one of the above-mentioned sacraments. In this sense, the term character indelibilis is a metaphor. By no means it refers to an ontological sort of engraving in the baptized soul, for instance. The theological idea of character indelibilis provides the basis for Christian belief that every individual who becomes church member through baptism maintains being Christian, even if he or she renounces fundamental Christian doctrines. Even in case of heresy or apostasy, the individual does not abandon being church member. Heresy in this sense means that a baptized individual dissents willfully and persistently from orthodox doctrines of faith, while apostasy means a deliberate and complete abandonment of the faith by a baptized individual. This bearing in mind, and referring to the topic of this conference, I will henceforth focus on the problem of religious affiliation, belonging, and apostasy in Christianity and Islam. The first part of my paper is devoted to Christianity, the second to Islam. And the first one will be a view from interior, the second from exterior, because I'm a Catholic theologian, not a specialist on Islam. In my conclusion, I will briefly present a hypothesis in order to provide some stimulus for discussion. First part, religious affiliation, belonging, and apostasy in Christianity. The Christian conception of character indelibilis is normally dealt with in systematic theology, particularly in ecclesiology and theology of sacraments. Apart from this, the conception of character indelibilis is discussed in canon law. Unfortunately, both traditions are hardly ever intertwined. The gap between systematic theology and canon law becomes even more obvious when we realize that, particularly in some Western states, church members enjoy the opportunity to leave the church. Here, leaving the church is simply realized by signing a formal statement disposed at a government authority. Particularly among German canonists, it is well disputed if a statement at a government authority fulfills the conditions of canon law for a defectus ab ecclesia actu formali. In any case, according to Christian doctrine, it is not possible to terminate church membership by such a statement on the sacramental level. Catholic tradition is familiar with the expression semel catholicus, semper catholicus, which means once a Catholic, always a Catholic. Neither an implicit nor a formal statement of a baptized individual to leave the church is sufficiently effective to terminate church membership. That applies particularly to schism, heresy, and even apostasy. Even a baptized individual who formally renounces Christian doctrines or acts blasphemous does not cease being church member. The principle semel catholicus, semper catholicus applies even more when a baptized individual converts to a non-Catholic church or a non-Christian religion. Thus, from a sacramental as well as juridical point of view, leaving the church seems to be impossible. Simultaneously, canon law states that the Christian faithful are always obliged to maintain communion with the church. Church membership means to be incorporated in the ecclesiastical communio. While this communion grants certain rights to the Christian faithful, it requires certain obligations from their part either. Christian faithful, I quote, are obliged to assist with the needs of the church so that the church has what is necessary for divine worship, for the works of the apostolate and of charity, and for the decent support of ministers. End of quotation. Usually, an individual who intends leaving the church will not be ready to fulfill such obligations. In his ecclesiastical encyclical Mystici Corporis, Pope Pius XII declared that a church member is only the individual who fulfills three conditions. He must agree to Christian creed, consent with the sacramental order of the church, and accept pontifical supremacy. In other words, according to the Pope, full church membership covers the unconditioned acceptance of the threefold vinculum symbolicum, liturgicum, and hierarchicum. Since the respective level of acceptance of the threefold vinculum may be quite different, this view is not consistent with the doctrine of character indelibilis. Based on the encyclical Mystici Corporis and referring to the documents of Second Vatican Council, Joseph Ratzinger explains that being member of the church means living in community with all its members. Consequently, nobody is a church member in full sense of the word if he or she doesn't hold its belief, participates in sacramental life, and goes along with its hierarchical order. Consequently, according to Ratzinger, the documents of the Council refer to gradual levels of church membership. Several texts of the teaching authority of Catholic Church express minor degrees of membership by the Latin term communio non plena. This having in mind, leaving the church by issuing a formal statement, deficere ab ecclesia actu formali, could be interpreted as performing a schism. The term means breaking off communion with other members of the church. According to canon law, a schism causes ipso facto the punishment of excommunication, which means exclusion from the reception of sacraments and the exercise of full rights in the church. This is even more the case when it comes to heresy or apostasy. Evidently, all these deviations harm ecclesiastical communion. Reconciliation with the church, in the sense of restoring ecclesiastical communion, is only possible under condition of credible repentance and conversion. It requires a formal statement before an ecclesiastical authority. This statement should be made personally, consciously, and freely. Sometimes reconciliation takes place during a liturgical celebration. Under no circumstances it needs a second baptism in order to perform a re-entry to Catholic Church. Referring to the topic of our conference, we may conclude Catholic doctrine and canonical practice discern between two levels of belonging to the Church. The first level is based on canon law and sacramental theology. Since Augustine's controversy with the Donatists, Catholic theology underlines that, particularly in the celebration of sacraments, God's commitment to grant his unconditioned grace is irrevocable. Consequently, no human decision or acting is capable to erase God's self-commitment in baptism. The second level affects the practical consequences of leaving the church. May such an act be implicit or explicit. Schism, as well as heresy or apostasy, inflicts the communion of a baptized individual with Christ and with his fellow Christian faithful. Even if on a doctrinal level church membership is never terminated, on the level of ecclesiastical life, church membership is severely corrupted by such inflictions. Furthermore, church authorities feel authorized to sanction religious divergence. In modern times, such sanctions refer to restrictions in sacramental life exclusively. In the past, sometimes they covered capital punishment as well. This having in mind, we now are ready to turn to the question of religious affiliation, belonging, apostasy in Islam. It is widely known that, according to Muslim understanding, pronouncing the Shahada establishes membership in Muslim community. This membership usually is considered being indissoluble. However, in Islam, there's no conception that might be compared with Christian conception of character indelibilis. This observation provokes the question, for what reason schism, heresy, and apostasy even today are firmly rejected by the overwhelming majority of Muslims and, moreover, are frequently punished severely in Islamic states by public authorities. At first glance, the Quran reveals that there is no single verse which mentions the case of explicit rejection of Islam after conversion. However, the Quran reports the case of some hypocrites, a group of people at Medina who outwardly profess Islam while inwardly harboring unbelief. It is notable that no punishment is prescribed for them as long as they refrain from rebellion. That indicates the fact that unbelief by itself is not punished in the Quran. However, it is said that a harsh punishment awaits the hypocrites in the afterlife. Referring to the pivotal question of the conference, that is the issue of religious belonging, the case of the Quran's dealing with the hypocrites seems to be quite significant. Hypocrites may be tolerated in Muslim community as long as they do not question or even menace its normative public order. Apostasy then is not so much a deviation from common belief. Instead, it's primarily a sort of practical digression or deviation from a peaceful coexistence. One might interpret this conception as a consequence of the overriding practical self-conception of Muslim faith, as it was shaped in the early history of the Ummah. This bears some consequences for the Islamic notion of belief. It always entails practical dimension of behavior in the face of God and in community with fellow believers. In its Medinan verses, the Quran distinguishes between the status of an individual who has converted to Islam and his belief in Islam. We already heard about it. Thus, there's a difference between the legal status of a Muslim as a member of the Islamic community and a believer. Believers will gain salvation in the final judgment, while unbelievers are submitted to punishment, particularly in case of rebellion or menacing the unity of Muslim community. Moreover, unbelievers can legally be killed even if they are members of the Muslim community. Particularly the Muslim party of the Kharijites during the First Civil War was ready to legitimate killing of Muslims, arguing that their enemies were unbelievers. Thus, it was already in the first century of the Muslim era that Muslims agreed on the death penalty for apostasy in Islam. It was the influential Shafi jurist Al-Ghazali who, for the first time in Muslim history, presented a systematic doctrine of apostasy. In his Takhafut al-Falasifa, Al-Ghazali discerned between a declared renunciation of Islam by a Muslim on the one hand and a secret renunciation on the other. The second form of apostasy comprises wrong beliefs, maybe on the nature of God, creation, or the afterlife. Unbelief, according to Al-Ghazali, is the denial of an explicit statement in the Quran or Hadith. According to Al-Ghazali, such a denial should be asserted by an ordinary Muslim authority. However, the alleged apostate or heretic should not be sentenced without being given the opportunity to renounce and to repent publicly. In this light, many Muslim jurists were reluctant to apply capital punishment to clandestine apostates or heretics. Although in different law schools we face divergent interpretations, the question remains whether or not a Muslim can be forcibly excluded from the community. The majority position is that even a schismatic, heretic, or apostate does not cease being Muslim, even if he or she converts to a non-Muslim religion and consequently becomes an unbeliever. He or she remains subjected to Muslim law. This, I would argue, is very similar to Christian conception of character indelibilis. Moreover, it reflects the distinction between personal belief and formal church membership that is familiar to Christian doctrine. However, while the effects are similar, the underlying reasons are different. According to Christian doctrine, church membership is based on a divine commitment that is mediated by sacramental celebration. It is God's commitment that it establishes an everlasting communion between the individual and God, as well as between the individual and the church. According to Muslim understanding, membership to Islam is based on the declaration of the Shahada. Consequently, it is a human act that establishes an everlasting belonging to a Muslim community. The personal commitment of an individual human being establishes his obligation to live according to the divine norms revealed in the Quran and according to the exemplary role of the Prophet. In a nutshell, while according to Christian belief, definitiveness is based on divine grace, definitiveness according to Muslim belief is based on human commitment. While insisting on the individual's capability to commit himself definitely to Muslim faith, one might say that Muslim conception appreciates the freedom of human beings in an extraordinary manner. Human beings are capable to take an irrevocable decision. In case of revocation, however, they must bear its consequences. Among these consequences appear the Muslim community's right to punish apostates, heretics, and schismatics. Punishment is justified by the fact that divergence from common ethical norms is a crime that affects the community and its peaceful coexistence. Insofar, according to Islamic tradition, government's authority obliged to warrant public order, punishment is not saved up to God's last judgment in the afterlife. In Christian tradition, punishment for apostates and heretics by no means was absent. However, the reason for punishment usually was a charge of divergent doctrine. The underlying ideas, however, were alike. Divergent doctrines, manners, unity, and cohesion of a social community. This confirms the assumption that according to Christian self-understanding, Christianity first and foremost is not religious behavior, but religious belief. What is the outcome of the preceding reflections referring to the relationship between religious belief, apostasy, and belonging? I come to my conclusion. In November 2002, American sociologist Douglas Marshall presented a concise study on the relationship between belief, belonging, and behavior. The objective of Marshall was to show that the cohesion of a social group is not exclusively based on shared opinions or beliefs. Instead, it is essentially based on ritual practices. I quote, "The role of rituals in the creation of belonging is suggested by the fact that social integration and a sense of unity among the most noted outcomes and functions of rituals." End of quotation. Marshall's thesis is pronounced in the very first sentence of his paper. The practice of ritual produces two primary outcomes, belief and belonging. End of quotation. According to Marshall, the notion belief means a significant step beyond mere knowledge, which is insufficient for human epistemic needs. Accordingly, Marshall characterizes belonging as a significant step beyond mere membership. Belonging is encouraged by attraction, identification, and cohesion. Marshall's thesis, according to my opinion, is convincing. Shared ritual practices form a common identity that not only shapes daily life behavior, moreover, it affects shared convictions and doctrines. Marshall rejects the view that cohesion of a social group is based on common belief exclusively. Instead, there are intertwined interrelationships between ritual practice, social behavior, everyday life, and religious belief. Belonging is an always precarious outcome of these complex interrelationships. This bearing in mind, let me briefly formulate my hypothesis. If it is true that rituals shape social identity, it is not simply belief that produces social behavior. Instead, we face a complex interrelationship between rituals, behavior, and belief. Consequently, we may understand punishment of apostasy, heresy, and schismatics as a sort of ritual practice. A sort of ritual practice that shapes community and social belonging. In this light, punishment appears being a sort of ritual practice and, in a certain sense, a sort of religious behavior. Collective behavior, shared ritual practice, and common belief shapes religious identities and the respective manner of belonging. Thus, it is only consequent that the opposite, particularly deviation from doctrine in Christianity or behavior in Islam, is interpreted being an insult to shared identity and social cohesion. Insofar identity and cohesion of a religious group in the last instance is based on God's will, religious divergence may be interpreted as sin. In order to avoid this interpretation and its frequently violent consequences, it needs acceptance of religious pluralism. Only acceptance of religious pluralism overcomes violent exclusivism and allows tolerance towards adherents of different religions and ideologies even in own ranks. Unfortunately, I do not have the time to elaborate this perspective in detail here. Nevertheless, up to now, I thank you very much for your attention.